This is the fifth and final week of our series we are calling Cornerstone. We are looking at the core foundational principles that have taken us to this place. We want to make sure they are ingrained in our culture so that we don't lose sight of them. In previous weeks of the series, we have looked at the importance of love, not just as something we feel, but something that we do. We looked at grace. The church is most appealing when grace is most apparent. 2 weeks ago, we reflected on this Greek word ecclesia, which was the word that Jesus used to describe the movement that he was building. The church is a movement, not a monument. Jesus established the church to make an impact on the world. Last week, we looked at having a concern for the lost. The church is one of the few, if not only, organizations that exist for its non-members. The church exists to reach out to people who are far from God and bring them into a relationship with Him. The foundational principles, love, grace, the church, and the lost are basic, and yet each and every one of them can be easily lost sight of. It is strange and bizarre, but churches lose sight of them all the time, and then they lose their way. As we close out our series, we are going to look at one last word churches often lose sight of, and to forget this word might be the strangest of all. We're looking at a passage again from the 21st chapter of Matthew's Gospel. The story takes place after Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. He had recently raised Lazarus from the dead, and pretty much the situation is out of control. Throughout his public ministry, he very skillfully kept the lid on the whole situation. But with the raising of Lazarus, he powerfully sets into motion the cataclysmic events that would ultimately and quickly lead to Calvary. The crowds are cheering him as king. The Jewish leaders are overcome with jealousy. And the Roman authorities are starting to get worried about insurrection and revolt. Jesus goes to the temple where he rather aggressively invites conflict. He wades into controversy, disputing with all the various political and religious factions of the day. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, who all hate him. Why? Pretty much because he's taken their playbook when it comes to approaching God and has just thrown it out, which would be bad enough in itself, but just to make matters worse, he's successful. He is successful, and they only dreamed of being successful. In fact, they're not successful at all. These religious leaders are entrusted with the care of God's family, the people of Israel, and growing this family. Instead, they had made it such a daunting and difficult to even try and live faithfully as a religious Jew that most ordinary people have simply walked away and given up trying. It is just too difficult. Nobody could do it. The leaders themselves could not do it. They actually and hypocritically absented themselves from many of the laws they tried to impose on everyone else. So they are enraged at the whole scenario and are looking for blood. This was the scene in the week we call holy. So in the midst of this alarming and amazing scene, what does Jesus do? He tells a story. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a hedge around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a tower. Then he leased it to tenants and went on a journey. So this was something that at that time, a businessman or entrepreneur would do. He would determine that a property was suitable for some investment like a vineyard. He oversees the hard work that lays the foundation for a return on his investment. He plants the vineyard, which is an obvious step. He puts up a hedge and builds a tower to keep out the wild animals and thieves that might damage, destroy, or steal his harvest. He digs a wine press, which would have been a basin carved out of stone in which the grapes were crushed. The grape juice would flow out of the drains in the press into vats where it fermented into wine. Then he rented the vineyard to farmers to tend the vineyard and produce the fruit that he was entitled to. This was a typical situation in that region in the first century. A wealthy landowner would set up a business arrangement with local peasants who otherwise would be completely destitute. Instead, they work for him and get a share in the profits from the sale of the wine. But in this case, the fruit of the vine belongs to the landowner. Thus, Jesus continues. When vintage time drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to obtain his fruit. But the tenants seized the servants, and one they beat, another they killed, and the third they stoned. Again he sent other servants, more numerous than the first ones, but they treated them in the same way. This is outrageous. The landowner seeks what already belongs to him, the fruit of the vine he planted that he owns, and these people who are supposed to be working for him withhold his fruit from him. The servants represent the prophets who God sent to the leaders of Israel time and time again, but the leaders mistreated them. Then it gets worse. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and acquire his inheritance." They seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and they killed him. So this is crazy. They kill the son. They killed him. This is an absolutely insane story. Anyway, we know that in every parable Jesus told, the characters all represent someone. Someone, for instance, usually represents God, and in this parable, this is the owner of the vineyard. This would mean that Jesus is the landowner's son, the one who is killed. The tenants, that would doubtless be, as Matthew later tells us, the religious leaders whom Jesus is telling the story to. But Jesus is such a masterful storyteller that they are not even thinking about that. They're caught up in the narrative itself. So Jesus asks, what will the owner of the vineyard do to those tenants when he comes? With moral outrage and indignation at the very idea of this injustice and breach of the established social order, they do not hesitate to answer. He will put those wretched men to a wretched death and lease this vineyard to tenants who will give him the fruit. Now here comes the lesson. Jesus says to them, "Did you ever read in the Scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? By the Lord has this been done. It is wonderful in our eyes." So Jesus tells the leaders that the Messiah, their long-awaited Savior, is to be rejected by them and then become the cornerstone for the new movement God is building, which is the church. He's establishing a new movement that will produce the fruit that will be successful in a way they have not been. He quotes Psalm 118, a psalm that was sung by pilgrims who were journeying to the temple to worship God. The new worship of God will not be based on a place, but on the person of Jesus. This entire building was designed to drive that point home. From the crucifix behind the altar to the image of the cosmic Christ above the center doors to the monstrance outside our main entrance, everything points to Jesus. Jesus is the cornerstone of our faith. We are talking about him because he became the cornerstone of a movement that has lasted for 2,000 years. We are talking about him today because the stone rejected by the builders rose from the dead and conquered the grave. Why was Jesus rejected by these religious leaders? Well, it was because he was successful and popular, and they were jealous. And the reason he was popular was because he was accessible and real. People loved to be with Jesus. They loved to hang out with him. They liked to eat with him and talk with him. He was charismatic. They felt in him the presence of God's love and joy and peace. He didn't make a relationship with God seem so distant and far away. While he was the holiest and most righteous person that ever lived, he didn't hold people's sins against them, but upheld the importance of living a moral life and challenge others to do the same, not in a way that was moralizing. The cornerstone of our faith is the person of Jesus Christ. We exist to lead people into a growing personal relationship with Jesus. Knowing Jesus is the single most important thing that can ever happen to anyone. He is the one who sets captives free. He is the way back home to our relationship with God. He is the life. He is the truth. He is the way to freedom. He is the way to joy. He is the way to peace and contentment. He is the way to healing and restoration. There is no other way. The purpose of his life, death, and resurrection was to ransom you from sin and deliver you from the clutches of evil, restore you to God so that his life could heal and fill your life. We exist as a church to help people know Jesus and become more like him. Everything we do is about learning to hear the voice of Jesus more clearly. It is about getting to know him and having a friendship with him that is genuine and real. This entire experience, each weekend at Mass, is designed to be an awesome experience with Jesus. We want people to experience the presence of God in this place. Our church, our building, our music, our Mass, our message is all about Jesus. The challenges we make in the message are about growing closer to Jesus. The liturgy is about the worship of God the Father through His Son Jesus in the Holy Spirit. The Eucharist, the source and summit of our faith, of course, is all about Jesus Christ. Our volunteers are trying to create environments where Jesus can touch hearts. Every element, every aspect, every moment of the entire weekend is designed to aid us in experiencing the living God, and nothing is more important than that. And that all seems so obvious, but it turns out it is actually easy for churches to forget about bringing people into a relationship with Jesus, our cornerstone. It can be easy for church workers and church people to stop investing in a relationship with Jesus. It can be easy to come to Mass and go through the motions and forget that it's about meeting with Jesus. Church becomes about knowing facts about Jesus rather than knowing Him. Church becomes about commitment to activity rather than a commitment to Christ. It becomes about making sure people living morally and keeping rules or maintaining the building or a dozen and one other things that might be good things or even necessary things, but no, they are not about Jesus. So, as we conclude this series, I invite you to pray this simple prayer when you come to church each weekend. Jesus, I want to know you better. You can make it a prayer every day. You can wake up in the morning. You can be driving in your car, even when you're brushing your teeth. Pray, Jesus, I want to know you better. Jesus, I want to know you better.